Welcome to the Tech Talks by Microsoft EMEA. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. The Tech Talks by Microsoft EMEA are a new project. We had our first live stream last week on Monday, and the benefit of the Tech Talk live stream for you is that you can ask your questions in the live stream via the chat or the comments option at YouTube. So if you are watching at YouTube, the channel of Sven Langenfeld or my YouTube channel, you will be able to use the chat functionality there if you log in, and then you can ask your questions. You can give feedback. You can give me feedback if audio is fine, if video is fine, and you can use this hour with your questions around Windows Server 2012 end of support and migrating to Windows Server 2022. I will use this hour for many live demos because last week we talked about the impact and the opportunities about Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 end of support. If you attended this session last week, I think you remember this slide here. This is the only slide I will pick from the webcast last week. If you were not part of the webcast last week, you can review the content on the YouTube channel where you are watching the live stream. So every live stream is available on demand when the stream has finished on the YouTube channels, so you can also consume the on-demand content. What we discussed last week is that Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 will be end of support in October 2023. So it's very important to plan for the migration to a later Windows Server version. And today I will showcase you how to migrate Hyper-V hosts, how to migrate file servers, how to migrate the domain controllers, and if we have enough time, we will also talk a little bit about remote desktop services, session hosts, or maybe if you use the previous version, the terminal services in Windows Server. If you are already on Windows Server 2016, I would also recommend you to migrate to a later version because yes, we have the support end date in January 2027. This is nearly 5 years from now. But the important thing is that we are already leaving, or we left the mainstream support in January this year. And my recommendation is always to have the Windows Server operating systems for your workload in the mainstream support. So if you are already on Windows Server 2016, it's easy for you to migrate in place to Windows Server 2019 or Windows Server 2022 because the in-place upgrade from Windows Server 2019 and Windows Server 2016 is available directly to Windows Server 2022. So it's N-2, we call this migration situation. So we can migrate from the previous and the version before the previous Windows Server version, so the two last Windows Server operating systems in place. So without reinstalling the operating system, in an in-place upgrade, the advantage is everything keeps as configured, every applications, every settings, the computer name, the IP address, nothing changes. So, but we want to focus to migrate from Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 because as you can see here, the path ends at Windows Server 2019. So if you migrate to Windows Server 2019, yes, then you are in the mainstream support till January 2024. So it could also be an option to migrate your previous workload in place to Windows Server 2019. This could be an option. My recommendation is to decide for Windows Server 2022. And I will show you how a side-by-side migration is possible. In-place upgrade, I will mention this with a few information, but I will show you in the live demos how to side-by-side migrate. This means you have a new hardware, you have a new installation of Windows Server 2022, and then you bring your workload to this new server. Let's first talk and see about how to migrate VMs to Hyper-V on Windows Server 2022. If you have an Hyper-V host with Windows Server 2016 or later, you can shut down all the VMs. You can start the Windows Server 2022 setup on the running Windows Server 2016 or 2019 and migrate to the latest version of Hyper-V with an in-place upgrade. This is an easy way. When you finished your in-place upgrade, you can start all the virtual machines. Your Hyper-V settings keep there. You don't have to reconfigure any virtual switches or things like this. Everything keeps like you have it configured before, but now on the latest Hyper-V version. And then side-by-side deployment, the way is a little bit different, because when we have Windows Server 2012 R2 or a previous version, or if we decide to run a newer version of hardware, so a new platform, then we will shut down the virtual machines, all the virtual machines or some of them. We will export the virtual machines first on the previous version host, and then we will import the virtual machines on the newer host. It's an easy step-by-step action. We can do this on a per VM basis. And this is what I want to show you in the first live demo. So first, we want to connect on an Hyper-V host with Windows Server 2012 R2. This is Windows Server 2012 R2. We'll show this to you in the server manager. Here you can see it's a Windows Server 2012 R2 standard. This is my Hyper-V host. The computer name is D114HV2012R2. This is the name of my Hyper-V host. And I will go to the Hyper-V manager and have one virtual machine there. Your production Hyper-V host will have several virtual machines, and you can decide for each virtual machine to shut this virtual machine down or to keep the machine running. So you can decide to have one big maintenance window to migrate all the VMs, or you migrate it on a per VM basis. For sure, then you have less downtime for your whole workload, but you have some downtime for each virtual machine to export this machine. So let's export the machine. Right-click, export, starts the export wizard. In the export wizard, we only specify a location where we want to export the machine. I want to export to the drive V, and I will create a new folder. It's called export. Let's take the export folder. I will select this one and click on export. It's an easy action to export the machine here. And now look to the export folder. I will see a subfolder with the name of the virtual machine. The next step is to switch to the newer Hyper-V host. I will import the machine. At the Hyper-V machine, it's called HV11. This one here is in Windows Server 2022. So now, before we start, it's important to find out, okay, the version of the operating system. It's Windows Server 2022 standard. It could also be data center. Be aware, you can migrate a standard VM to a data center host, but you cannot migrate regarding the licensing. From the technical perspective, you can, but regarding the licensing, you cannot migrate a data center VM onto a standard host. This is why I always recommend to install virtual machines with Windows Server 2022 or with Windows Server standard. The version doesn't matter, because with standard, you are more flexible, and the data center features you usually don't need inside the virtual machine. Usually, you don't need storage spaces direct inside the virtual machine. Yes, for demoing, I'm doing a lot of demos with storage spaces direct in virtual machines, but for production, usually not. Usually, you don't need software-defined networking. Usually, you don't need inside the VM unlimited virtual usage rights. This is what you usually need on your Hyper-V host. And if you have licensed your host with data center, you can install your VMs with data center or with standard. And I always use standard because then I'm more flexible. I can migrate the virtual machines also to another standard host, and I can convert a standard VM to data center without reinstalling this machine. Vice versa, it's not possible. It's not possible to convert a virtual machine without reinstallation from data center to standard. But from standard to data center, it's possible. So this is a recommendation for you. If you didn't know this, I would recommend to you to act like this in the future. Okay, so this is my Hyper-V host. So now the question is, which Hyper-V versions does this host support? Let's use a PowerShell, because in the PowerShell, we can use a get -vm host, and there's a supported version. Get VM host supported version. Let's execute this. And here we can see with this get VM host supported version commandlet, we get an information about the supported guest VM versions we have inside the Windows Server 2022 Hyper-V host. The default is Windows Server 2022 configuration version 10 for the virtual machines. But we also have support for version 9. This is the version that was introduced with Windows Server 2019. And we have also support for version 8. This is the version we received with Windows Server 2016. We don't have configuration versions older than version 8. So let's check which configuration version our Windows Server 2012 R2 host has. Let's go to the 2012 R2 host. Let's check here. This machine here has a configuration version 5. It has a generation 2. The generation 2 was introduced in Windows Server 2012 R2. The generation didn't change since 2012 R2, so even Windows Server 2022 supports generation 1 and generation 2 VMs. The version here in Windows Server 2012 R2 is version 5, and we have seen at the Hyper-V host on Windows Server 2022 that version 5 is actually not supported. So what to do? Let's see what Hyper-V does. We could use Windows Admin Center to import the virtual machine. This would be possible, but I will go directly to the host to show you what happens. I will go directly to the Hyper-V host. So you have two options. You can use the Hyper-V Manager, or you can use the Windows Admin Center. And what I will do, I will copy this export folder. So I will go to my host. It's the D114-WS 2012 R2 \V. This is my drive there. Let's see if this is the correct server name here. It's an HV 2012 R2. So this was a typo I had here, not an WS, it was an HV. This is my source server where I exported the machine. Let's copy the export folder and bring the export folder to this local machine here. So now we could export this machine, import this machine directly from the export folder. My recommendation is always to copy this folder of the virtual machine here inside the export folder and transfer it to the final destination. So I will take this one here. Let's see, there are old machines here inside this folder. So I will delete this old folder here and bring this folder here to the VMs folder. Why should I do this manually? The import wizard also supports to move a virtual machine to the final destination. But if you forget this option, if you forget this checkbox to copy the machine to the default virtual machines folder, then it might happen that you import the machine, but the data remains in the export location. So in the worst case, you exported the virtual machine to an USB hard disk drive, And now you import the virtual machine from the USB hard disk drive, and you forget to check the option to copy the virtual machine to the default VM folder, and then the virtual machine will run from this USB hard disk drive or from the network share. And if you copy the virtual machine before you import the virtual machine to the correct destination, then this cannot happen because the machine is already where the machine should be. And I have a second advantage. The copy via File Explorer is much faster than the transfer via the import wizard. Now let's see how the import works. Let's import the machine here. I will choose import virtual machine in the Hyper-V manager. We have the same option in Windows Admin Center. I will go to next. I will select the folder. The folder is my computer. It's the drive C, sorry, not the drive C, it's the drive E. It's the VMs folder, and it's the folder of the virtual machine. My virtual machine name was 2012 R2 NVM01. I will go to next. I have the information about the virtual machine, then next. And now we have the important options about how to import the machine. Register the virtual machine in place using existing unique ID. This is the default. And I will use this one because I have prepared everything to have a successful import. Restore the virtual machine, use the existing unique ID, will copy the virtual machine to the default VM path. So the second option you have to use if you are importing the virtual machine from a USB drive and you didn't, and you don't want to stay the virtual machine on the USB drive. You want to move the data of the virtual machine to your VM storage. And copy the virtual machine does the same, but it will create a new unique ID. Behind the name of each virtual machine, we have an ID of this computer, and each ID has to be unique. I'm moving a virtual machine from one host to another host via export-import. I would not create a new unique ID because maybe you are using a monitoring solution. If you create a new unique ID, this monitoring solution does not know that this is the same virtual machine that was 5 minutes before on another host. For the monitoring solution, this now will be a new virtual machine, and you will lose your historical data, or you have to remap this historical data. So the recommendation is here, register. For sure, if you are using a sysprep machine to import this here, you will use a unique ID. But in this scenario, we are migrating a virtual machine from another host, then this is the way. So register virtual machine in place. I will click on next and finish, and the virtual machine is registered here. All the settings are there. And the interesting thing that happened, the virtual machine configuration version was upgraded to version 8. So Hyper-V didn't present an error message and said, okay, this configuration version of the machine is too old. I cannot import the virtual machine. Hyper-V said, okay, let's migrate the configuration version of the virtual machine to the latest supported version, version 8, and then let the administrator decide to stay on version 8 or to right-click and upgrade configuration version again. Via this upgrade configuration version, I can upgrade to the latest configuration version. This is your decision. This depends on the configuration of the machine. And here via click on upgrade, I can upgrade to version 10. This is optional. Configuration version can be described like the possible settings options for such a virtual machine. So as newer the configuration version is, as more settings I have. But let's imagine you want to bring this machine later to a Windows Server 2016 based host. Then you shouldn't upgrade the configuration version because, as we have seen, Windows Server 2016 supports version 8, Windows Server 2019 supports version 9, and 2022 supports version 8, 9, and version 10. Now let's upgrade the version, and we are on version 10 here. We can start the virtual machine here and access all the workload now. So I would say easy steps to migrate a virtual machine. If you are on a later version of Hyper-V, you can also use live migration or Hyper-V replica to migrate. So if we are already on Windows Server 2016 or 2019, we can migrate VMs to an host with an in-place upgrade, shut down all the VMs, migrate the host to 2022, start all the VMs, and decide which VM should be upgraded in the configuration version. This is an additional manual step. We can use live migration without any downtime from the previous host to the later one. And we can configure Hyper-V replica and then reverse the replication direction. This is possible if you are on Windows Server 2016 minimum. And keep in mind, my recommendation, always stay on the version that is in mainstream support, because then you have all these opportunities, all these options. We are in our scenarios here on Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2012. And for these versions, we cannot use live migration to 2022 or Hyper-V replica to 2022. This starts with these versions. And yes, you could say, okay, Windows Server 2016 is already out of mainstream support, but today we have these options: in place upgrade, live migration, and Hyper-V replica. Okay, let's talk about the file servers, how to migrate file servers. Same situation. A file server can be migrated in place when the file server is on Windows Server 2016 or 2019 directly to Windows Server 2022. The advantage of an in-place migration from file server is that we keep all our file shares, we keep all our access control lists, and we keep all our data for sure. We keep the computer name, the IP address. If you have a previous version, or if you want to migrate to new hardware, or maybe you want to migrate your physical file server to a virtual machine, then a perfect service is the storage migration service, because the storage migration service provides all these advantages: keep the computer name, the IP address, keep the file shares, keep the access control list, keep the data, but not on the old server, but on a new server. Let's have a look at this, how the storage migration service works in detail. To use the storage migration service, we need the Windows Admin Center. And I have a virtual machine with the Windows Admin Center. This is my Windows Admin Center machine, and I have several virtual machines here in the list here. And I have a virtual machine that's called SMS11, the Storage Migration Service machine. This is a Windows Server 2022. It's on server standard in my network, and this server is already configured to run the storage migration service. You will find the storage migration service in the tool lists. When you click on storage migration service and you never use the storage migration service, then you will see here a window that says, okay, here you can install the storage migration service on this machine. What I can see here, you will see this sometimes on your Windows Admin Center also, there's an update available for this extension. I can use the previous version, or I could update the storage migration service. Let's do this here to ensure that we are on the latest version. I've installed different extensions, and here an extension is the storage migration service, and an upgrade is available, a newer version. Let's install this version. It's a very fast update process. It's a small extension for the Windows Admin Center. This ensures that the migration will work with additional flexibility, with additional options, with additional feature set. So let's go to the Windows Admin Center and let's select the storage migration service again. And here we go to the storage migration service. And the storage migration service tells me I have three important steps. The first one is to create a job to inventory the servers. The second one is to transfer the data from the old server. And the third one is to cut over to the new servers. The cut over means I will take the computer name, the IP address, and this will be moved to the new server. Okay, let's close this and create a new job. The first step. This will be an SMS job 01. I will use the SMS job 01. Okay. Sorry, the SMS job 01 already exists. I want to take the SMS job 02. The job 02. Okay, it's only a name for this job we will configure. Okay, in this wizard, the first step, I will need credentials for the device I want to migrate. It's my source server. I don't have file server cluster at the source. So I have two options here for the job settings. I could include the administrative shares. I don't want to include them. And I don't want to migrate from a file server cluster. What I want to migrate is a single server. Administrative shares are the shares with a $sign at the end. So I don't want to migrate any of these administrative shares. I go to next, install required tools. This one will check if there's anything to install on the orchestration server. I already prepared this on the SMS 11, so nothing is missing here because this saves us time here in the live demo. This happens automatically. I will add devices to scan. Let's check the file server we want to migrate. The file server we want to migrate is the file server with the VM name D114FSOld. I will connect to this machine, and the FSOld is a 2012 R2, and this machine has the Windows computer name File Server 11. The File Server 11 is in Windows Server 2012 R2 standard. So what I will do, I will add this machine to the file server, to the Windows Admin Center, add a device. I will add the device name D114-FS11. So this is my file server. This is Windows Server operating system. And then here, I can start the scan. So keep in mind, till the scan is running, you can ask your question in the comments. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use them here. If you are watching this video not in full screen, maybe the live demos are a little bit too small for you. This is the reason why I'm often using the zoom functionality to ensure that the important steps are highlighted for you. The recommendation is to watch this live stream in full screen because we are streaming in full HD video quality and screen resolution. And so in my previous screen, I'm only using a smaller window, and there I can it's hard to read everything. But in my live window I have here I have the full high definition resolution, and there everything is clear and fine. So keep in mind, it's better quality if you switch the video to full screen. So what happened here? I added this machine in Windows Admin Center. I started the scan via the Start Scan button. The config scan was succeeded. The SMB scan was succeeded. I have 10 gigabytes of data on this machine, 4,312 files. There are no files failed. I have the start time, and the state is succeeded. So the scan was successful. And at the bottom of the page, I should see some details about the scan when I'm looking at the details window while the scan is running, or when I click onto the machine when the scan has finished. I can see there's a share, it's called data. A second share is source. And I have the configuration of the machine. I have the source, Windows Server 2012 R2 standard. I have the network adapters there, and I have my volumes on the source. Okay, let's go to next. The next step is to transfer the data. I have my credentials for the destination device. This is my target server. I have also the option to decide what will be my destination device. An existing physical server or VM, a new Azure VM, or maybe I don't want to transfer files from this server because I have 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 servers in the list, and I only want to transfer from file server 12 or 13 or 14. The destination server is D114 minus FS file server 21. So I will scan this device. And this device is evaluated. I will see, okay, there's a source volume, it's drive E. The destination volume will also be drive E. I can decide if the shares are included or not. I could decide, for example, to have the data share, but not the sources share, via this include button at the end. I will take both of these shares. I want to have the data and the sources share. The next step, I can adjust some settings like what happens with the folders that would be overwritten, because maybe there is already something at the target. I can override the transfer validation. This saves time, but I would always validate before transfer. I have the validation method to create a checksum for transmitted files. I have the maximum duration. I can define when a timeout will occur. We can migrate users and groups. This is important to understand, because what we migrate here is the local users and the local groups on these servers. Keep in mind, if you are designing a file server regarding the Microsoft recommendations, you have your account in the domain. It's on a domain controller. We don't migrate domain controllers here. We have a domain group where we add this user to a group, for example, finance. And then we have a local group on the file server. And this local group could be, for example, access finance data. And this local group receives the permission. So the recommendation is to use this AGDLP regulatory here, to use an account in the domain, a domain group, a local group, and add the permission to this group. You can skip the local group, you can skip the domain group, you can use the user directly to provide the permissions. So there are thousands of ways how to configure this, but the recommendation is to use the AGDLP principle to ensure that you use all the layers you have here. And the L layer, the local group, is on the file server. This is not in the domain. And this is the reason why it might happen that you also want to migrate local groups. You want to migrate maybe local users if you have them here. Important. Many customers think they can use this to migrate domain controllers. This is not migrating domain controllers. This is only migrating local groups and local accounts on the file server. In the next step, not in storage migration service, but the next step of this live stream, we will have a look at the domain controllers, how to migrate them. Okay, maximum retries, delay between retries, and then via next, I will see the required features on the target host. They are validated, and if something is missing, it's installed on the target host. And in the next step, the devices will be validated. The source and the target can be validated here via a click on validate. Let's validate this here, the source server, the destination server, and I will see all the steps have been passed. When I click on passed, I get detailed information about what was validated. The destination exists. The destination server is not the same than the source server. SMB connection works. We can use the credentials. Credentials has administrative privileges and so on. So you have detailed information of everything that has validated. And if there should be a warning or an error, you can see this here and you can work on this. Okay, let's go to next. And in this final step of phase 2 of the SMS job, we transfer the data. We transfer our 4,000 files, 10 gigabytes, from file server 11 to file server 21. Let's start the transfer. So depending on your host performance, depending on your storage performance, depending on your network, this will take a while. But at the bottom of this page, you will see detailed information. You have the throughput of your transfer, you have the progress, you have the progress processed files, you have the estimated time to completion. Yes, I have a very small file server, but this is helpful for your production environment. We have the transfer details, we have the SMB details, we have the Azure File Sync information. If we transfer data via Azure File Sync or to Azure File Sync, we have seen this on the intro slide. This is also an option we have here. So 97% completed, 3,000 files processed, 9.99 gigabytes of data processed, estimated time to complete less than 1 minute. So here the detailed information about our migration, about our movement, or no, it's not a move, about our copy of files to this new file server. So now I have an error here. Couldn't transfer some devices, couldn't transfer some files. Let's check what happened. I can go to the transfer detail, and there's a transfer log and an error log only. I can download the error log, and in the error log file, I can see what happened here. So error log is downloaded. And in the error log, I will usually find 1 or 2 files that were open, where we had access to, where we had a blocker on. Okay, something went wrong to download the file. Let's try it again, error log only. In this error log, you will see maybe on this server, the orchestrator server, there's missing something. Let's check this. If file and printer sharing is enabled on the orchestrator server, I will go to this one here because this is not configured automatically. Let's go to the SMS server and check the firewall settings. In this error report, you will see the details about the files that were blocked. As I mentioned, usually files that were in excess when you started the migration. So let's check the firewall. If it was the file and printer sharing setting, we can fix this. If not, you have to believe me. Let's see here. Yes, file and printer sharing is missing here on this machine. And this is exactly what the error said. And because this is a security relevant setting, Windows Admin Center didn't configure this for us. It says ensure port TCP 445 SMB file and printer sharing is open on the orchestration server. So let's try it again. Download the report, and now it's downloaded successfully. I can open the file and I will see, okay, when I go to Notepad, these are 2 files. And this is something like data boot manager files, and this was in excess, so something was wrong with this file, so it couldn't transfer these files. So you can check if these files are relevant, if they are required, and you could transfer again. Maybe these were open databases on your file server or things like this. Here we can start delta transfer. We can transfer the differences, because let's imagine my transfer took 1 minute. Maybe your transfer will take 2 or 3 hours because you have a file server with terabytes of data. Then here you can start the differences till the differences get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then when you have transferred everything, you can go to the next step to start with the cutover. The cutover is optional. The cutover is the great step, the great opportunity to configure your target server exactly as the source server. But some customers don't want this. They say, okay, this copy of the data and transfer of access control lists and so on is great, but we don't want to rename the target server, because what happens? This system again asks about the credentials. The credentials are fine. I will go to next. Then I have my source server, the FS11. The FS11 actually uses a network adapter with DHCP, dynamic host configuration. This is fine for me. And the source server will be renamed. I could use a randomly generated name. What I will do, I will rename the source server to D114-FS11 old. This is my old file server 11. The new IP address of this server should again be a DHCP address. The destination network adapter at the destination server should be the domain network adapter. The server has several network adapters. I will choose the domain adapter. So what I specify is here the settings for the source server after the migration. Okay, next, adjust settings. In the adjust settings, I could use credentials for the Active Directory. I will use the stored credentials. And I will validate the devices. So I can click on validate. The validation starts. And as we had a validation before we transferred the data, we again have a validation here about this cutover process with detailed information, with a detailed list where we can see we can cut over, does this work? We can connect to the source computer. What's about the local user accounts on the source computer and so on. So everything is checked and validated. So before we start the cutover, let's check the machines again. I have my source server, the FS old, which has actually the computer name FS11. This is my source machine. Let's go to the target machine. It's the FS21. This one is my target machine. I have a typo here. This is my target machine. It's the file server 21 and it's Windows Server 2022 standard. We already have the file shares there. We already have the folders, the access control list. This already has been migrated. So let's use the Windows Admin Center to have the cutover now. The final step is cutover. As I mentioned, it's an optional step, but it's a very interesting step. What happens here? Because when I start the cutover, it pulls the information from the source server. It renames the source server to FS11 old. Then it changes the name of the destination server from FS21 to FS11. And both servers are restarted. And my customers can continue to work on a file server that has the Windows computer name D114-FS11, but it's now Windows Server 2022. It's now the latest file server version. It has the same file server name. It has the same shares. It has the same access control list entries. And this is a great tool. Here we can see this is the actual status, source device current, destination device current. actually we have adding the source computer to the domain. Yes, it has to be added again because we have a rename action here. Here we will first see the new name for the source server, then for the destination server. When we look at my machines, we will see that the file server 11 actually is restarting. It has to be restarted for this name change of the computer name. Then also the file server 21 is restarting. Everything automated. I don't have to do anything manually here. It works really great. So actually 50% restarting the source computer, second restart. For our configuration, we need 2 restarts. The second restart is actually happening. Still 50% of the cut over here. Second restart is running. The rename action takes place. Let's check the machines. The file server 21 has restarted. The file server the file server 11 has been restarted. Now let's check the Windows Admin Center. Here, when I refresh the view, the source device current should now in a few seconds or minutes change to FS11 old, and the destination device will change to D114 FS11 without any old there, because this inherits the name of my previous file server. Now 77% adding the destination computer to the domain. We now can see the source device current is the FS11 old, what I mentioned. The name of the source device has already changed. Adding the destination computer to the domain is now the step. Then we need again a restart of the machine, and then we will see the new computer name here. It takes a while, but in a production environment, it's not required that you wait for this. You can leave your Windows Admin Center, everything works automatically, and you can work on other steps there. My recommendation is to keep this window here open, but in Windows Admin Center, we can open additional tabs. I can right-click here and open the link in a new tab. Now I have a new Admin Center session, and in this new Admin Center session, I can work on additional configuration things. I could, for example, go to one of my Hyper-V hosts, for example, this Hyper-V 11, and prepare an import of a virtual machine or something like this. So you can work on your Windows Admin Center, but the recommendation is to keep this window open here and to open a new tab. You can open as many tabs as your resources on your client host are able to provide. And so you can keep on working on another server, on other tasks. And I will use the time to show you how an import via the Windows Admin Center works, because I showed you how to import virtual machines in this Hyper-V migration live demo via the Hyper-V Manager. In the Windows Admin Center, you can use the add and import option. And it's the same we have in the Hyper-V Manager, but here via the web-based Windows Admin Center console. So with additional flexibility regarding the host you will use. So still 77%. Let's check what the machines are doing. Here's the file server old. This machine is added to the domain. And then in the final step, the rename will occur. So we will use the time to already have a look at the migration of the Active Directory, and I will come back to this step in a few minutes, because it takes a little bit longer than I expected for this step, and we will not stay additional minutes here. So what I will do, I will talk a little bit about migrating an Active Directory domain. The important thing is, when we migrate Active Directory, we have to keep in mind the different versions of Active Directory domain controllers we are using in our environment. So To ensure that Windows Server 2022 can be used in combination with these previous versions of domain controllers, it's important to have an Active Directory and forest functional level that is compatible between these servers. So the forest functional level and domain functional level means that the version here in this screenshot, Windows Server 2016, is the oldest version of domain controller that is supported in combination with Windows Server 2022 when I select this, but we will see there are also previous domain and forest functional levels. We will see this in the next live demo. Here my file server is still migrating. So let's go to a virtual machine that I planned for the Active Directory domain services. Let's go to the server 21. I will connect to this machine. So this will be a new file server, a new domain controller in our existing domain. I will use the Windows Admin Center to manage add roles and features. In this role-based and feature-based installation, I will select the Active Directory domain services. And I will also select the DNS server because we need an DNS domain name system in combination with Active Directory domain services. And the first action is it only installs the services on our server. Nothing is configured here. Only the configuration of the roles is done here. So I will install these components, and then we are ready to configure Active Directory domain services on this machine. So this will, depending on your machine size, on your hardware, or in my scenario, this is a virtual machine, depending on your resources. This will need a few minutes till this is installed. And when the installation has finished, you will find a configuration with it here in this notification section here. So this is finished. I can close the window and I can go to the notification and start the Active Directory configuration with it for this new server. My recommendation is to exactly as I have done it. I would install Windows Server 2022, add this server to the domain, rename this server to the planned name, because then the required steps in this configuration wizard for Active Directory is optimized. We don't have to re-authenticate and things like this. So what I've prepared, I've installed the Windows Server 2022. Standard is absolutely fine for domain controller. I added this machine to my existing Active Directory domain where I have already the Windows Server 2012 R2 domain controllers, or we have still Windows Server 2012 R2 domain controllers. Now we want to configure here the server to a domain controller, promote the server to a domain controller, mentioned via the notification. I want to add a new domain controller to an existing domain. This is the important step here. Add a domain controller to an existing domain. And with next, I can decide for the domain controller options. I can decide for the global catalog, read-only domain controller, and so on. But before we go this way, let's see what directory levels this domain controller supports. Sorry, this is my password in my virtual world. So what I want to show you, choosing this option, this is not how to add a domain controller. This is only the option where I can show you the different levels. Let's have a look at the available functional levels of Windows Server 2022. And here you can see this is the full list of supported Active Directory domain levels. So for sure, we can support domain controllers in the same domain with Windows Server 2022 that have Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. There can also be domain controllers with Windows Server 2016. There can also be domain controllers with Windows Server 2019, but there's no functional level 2019 because beginning with Windows Server 2019, there was no new Active Directory domain level. So the oldest version that is supported is Windows Server 2008, but Windows Server 2008 is not any longer supported. You only can use this if you have extended security updates for your domain. And we discussed this last week, what extended security updates are, how you can get them. So for the traditional customer, we will have this compatibility here, and then we are fine. Let's go back to the add new domain to existing forest, add new domain controller to existing forest, mhdemolab.de. We have the domain controller options like read-only domain controller, global catalog, and things like this. We have our password for the recovery mode we'll use at this machine. And then this newer domain controller will be added to the existing domain. Okay, so it's a very, very easy way. I can replicate from any domain controller. I can keep the path and so on. I have the checks, and then I can install this here. When I remove the previous domain controller versions in my domain, I can also migrate the domain functional level to Windows Server. Yeah, depending on what domain controller versions you still have, Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2016. As I mentioned, a later or newer version is not available here. Okay. So there's one question in the chat. Are there drawbacks if I only copy the VHDX file to my new VM's virtual hard disk folder where I created a new VM with same name as the old one and just re-register without using export and import? With the export and import, we are able to migrate between more versions. So the export and import way is the safe thing. Also, if you are maybe have existing snapshots or checkpoints on the machine. But Helmut is absolutely right. You also can just copy the virtual machines folder and re-register it. This usually works. If this does not work, you should try export import, because with export import, let's say your machine is somehow neutralized regarding the version. Yeah. Do you switch the IP addresses after installing of the new domain controller and after FSMO transfer? The transfer of the flexible single master options is very important. You can do this via PowerShell, you can do this via the command line, and you can transfer the FSMO roles via the GUI. Not all of them, only 4 of them. So one remains in PowerShell. Let's go to one of my existing domain controllers. This here is one of my existing domain controllers. This is already a newer one, but I have also previous versions here. And we could use a traditional tool. I think everybody knows this. I mentioned it's also possible via PowerShell or via GUI. But if you prefer the traditional tools that work with every Windows version, you can open a command prompt, run as an administrator. I will choose a different font size to ensure that you can see what I'm doing here. And then we could use an NTDS util. And the Attendees util supports and help on each menu layer. And there we have an option in the Attendees util where we can see the local roles and so on, the security accounts. We could configure different settings and so on. And with the NTDS util, we also have the opportunity to move the FSMO roles to a new server. So we can choose the roles options to change the roles ownership. Now we are in the FSMO maintenance. Here in the FSMO maintenance, we can choose to transfer the master. To which server do we transfer the master? We can transfer the master, the naming master, the infrastructure master, the PDC emulator, the read master, the schema master to the connected server. So I could go to connections and then connect to server D114 minus DC02. Yes, now I'm connected to this server. I have the server connections. I will move one layer above, and now I could start with this transfer actions here. Yes, this is very important. So thank you for this question or remark. Absolutely, you have to transfer your FSMO roles before demoting the old domain controller and before removing the old domain controller. Regarding the IP address, this depends. I would recommend to keep your configuration of your domain controller and scripts so flexible that you are not required to change the IP address, but it's possible to change the IP address. So if you want to have your previous domain controller's IP address, the next step will be to transfer the roles, then to demote the previous domain controller, then to remove the domain controller from the domain, and then to put the old IP address on the new Hyper-V host here. Okay, so the domain controller. So many things you have to care about. Let me add 1 minute, sorry for the delay in time, about migrating RDS hosts. When you migrate RDS hosts, what you have to keep in mind is the compatibility to Office. And there we have some new information regarding Windows Server 2022, because Windows Server 2022 supports the Office 2021, so the long-term servicing version of Office, but not the Office 365 apps. This is important to know. If you want to use the Office 365 apps, you have to use Windows Server 2019. Windows Server 2019 supports both Office 21 LTSC and Office and Microsoft 365 apps, or the recommendation is to use an alternate technology to remote desktop services, like, for example, Azure Virtual Desktop or VDI scenarios. It's also possible to use Azure Stack HCI on, Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. And this is our topic of our next Tech Talk, because in our next Tech Talk on 25th of April, we will migrate to Azure Stack HCI with different workloads. Azure Stack HCI is a great solution. It runs on premises in your data center, but compared to Windows Server, you have many additional functionalities there. And this is what we will discuss and see in many live demos on 25th of April. So looking forward to see you there again. And on 21st of April, we have 1 hour of Tech Talk for your questions. We had 2 questions today about the VHDX import and the FSMO transfer. And there's one additional question or note here: transfer the IP address because of several machines with static IP settings and to keep the DNS settings. Yes, this if you have this situation, you can change the IP address. This is possible. On 21st of April, you can bring every question you have from the Microsoft Universum regarding licensing, regarding technical stuff in the chat. So looking forward to have you there. And the full list of Tech Talks is available here. We will have additional Tech Talks about what is Azure Stack HCI in May, how to deploy Azure Stack HCI, how to manage Azure Stack HCI. In June, we have the licensing, benefits of Windows Server 2022 licensing, deployment and managing of monitoring Windows Server 2022, and Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. So many Very interesting topics. Looking forward to have you there. And thank you for your time. And thank you for your additional time. I needed 5 minutes more today because of these many live demos we had here. So thank you for your time. Looking forward to see you next week on 21st of April for the questions, and on 25th of April for the Tech Talk, always on the YouTube channels you also use today. So thank you for your time. Have a nice day. See you next week. Bye.